Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Crystal Noseworthy-Baker. I am the Regulatory Manager for Key Accounts for Ascent Compliance, and I will be doing the webinar today. You can see on this intro slide, there's my contact information as well as the company's general contact information, info@ascentcompliance.com, and the telephone number, as well as our website. We will be doing questions at the end of the webinar, so feel free, please, to submit the questions in the toolbar under the questions section. Please, if you can, stick to the questions section instead of the chat section or comment section. The presentation today will be recorded, and the slide deck, the recording, and an FAQ document of all the questions submitted during the 2 sessions of the webinar. So we did have one session this morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and this one is, of course, running at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Those will all be available by Friday, the 20th of January. I'm going to get started. I believe we have the majority of our attendees, and we've given some extra time for everyone to sign in. So I'm going to begin the presentation. Today, as you are all aware, we are going to be talking about the addition of 20 new SVHCs to the SVHC candidate list and talking about that, the impact and how companies are going to be affected by these new SVHCs. A quick introduction to Ascent Compliance. We deal with consulting, IT, and operations in terms of compliance to REACH, ROS, CLP, and quite a few other regulations, environmental regulations. Under consulting, we help with global requirements, compliance strategies, as well as regulatory interpretations and impacts. We have a software offering. We have a compliance software created by Ascent. It is a cloud computing software offering, so it actually doesn't need to be on inside any firewalls for companies. And we also can customize this software to specific requirements for a given company. And of course, combining the consulting aspect and the IT software offering, we help with operations in terms of program implementation and data management. Not a heavy agenda today, however, there is quite a bit of information to cover. I will be going at a pretty good clip, as I do like to finish on time at 3 p.m. And as I mentioned, of course, please submit questions, and I will answer what I can at the end of the webinar. And anything that I don't answer by 3 p.m., I will be including in an FAQ document, and the answers will come there. And of course, if you have any questions after this webinar is over, please don't hesitate to contact us. Today we're going to look at the additions to the SVHC candidate list, the industries and products affected by the new SVHCs, the requirements associated with those new SVHCs. We're going to do a section on REACH up to now, which is basically getting the pulse from major industry players as to how REACH has impacted them and how they're dealing with REACH right now. We will do a more in-depth coverage of Ascent services. And of course, as I mentioned, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. I'm just taking a small pause. It appears as though some people are having some problems with audio. I'm only getting, I had one person ask me at 2:03, but I don't believe I had started speaking yet. And then I have another individual who is still having issues through the computer at 2:08. And others, okay, there we go. We do have the audio working. If you have any issues, there is a dial-in number, so that is not just through the computer. You can actually do it through your phone, and that should be in the audio section of the toolbar if you are having some problems. All right, let's move on through our webinar. All right, I've got a table here of the new additions to the SVHC candidate list. There are 20 substances, which of course now brings the SVHC candidate list to 73 in total. And these 20 were added on December 19th, 2011. I have included in this table a section on uses and the materials that you'll see these in. But of course, I will also do a summary after as to the industries specifically affected. DMAC and N-dimethylacetamide is primarily used as a solvent, mainly in the manufacture of various substances and in the production of fibers for clothing and other applications. It's also been used as a reagent in products such as industrial coatings, polyamide films, paint strippers, and ink removers. So we've got it as a solvent, a reagent, and we are finding it in industrial coatings, polyamide films, paint strippers, and ink removers. The lead diazide, lead azide, and lead stiffnate, or styphnate, these lead substances are seen mostly in the pyrotechnic, explosive, and ammunition industries. So lead diazide and lead azide are mainly used as an initiator or booster in detonators for both civilian and military uses, and then as an initiator in pyrotechnic devices. Lead styphnate is mainly used as a primer for small caliber and rifle ammunition. Other common uses are in munition pyrotechnics, powder-actuated devices, and detonators for civilian use. Next on the list is MOCA, or 2,2-dichloro-4,4-methylene dianiline. And this is mainly used as a curing agent in resins and in the production of polymer articles, and also for the manufacture of other substances. It may also be used in construction and in arts. Phenolphthalein, for those of you who have ever worked in a laboratory setting, is a common laboratory agent. It is a pH indicator. So it's used mostly in the production of pH indicator paper and then in medicinal products. Then we have another lead substance popping up, and lead dipicrate is much less common than the lead styphnate or the lead diazide. No registration has actually been submitted to the ECHA for this substance, which means that if it is either being manufactured in or imported into the European Union, it is in amounts below 1 ton per year. It is an explosive like the lead diazide and the lead styphnate. It may be used in low amounts in detonator mixtures together with the two other mentioned lead compounds. So this is a very specific substance, again looking at pyrotechnics, ammunition, and explosives. Aluminosilicate refractory ceramic fibers and zirconia aluminosilicate refractory ceramic fibers are very specifically used. They are used for high temperature insulation, almost exclusively in industrial applications. So we're looking at insulation of industrial furnaces and equipment for the automotive and aerospace industry, and then we would also see them in fire protection, so buildings and industrial process equipment. Some of you may recognize these two substances as they do actually already exist on the SVHC candidate list. However, there were some identity issues that arose from their original inclusion to now, and therefore they've been added again with a much clearer identity of what they include. 1,2-dichloroethane, ethylene dichloride, is mainly used for the manufacture of other substances. It has some minor uses as a solvent in the chemical and pharmaceutical industry. The next three substances are mainly used in mixtures for metal surface treatment, and they are seen in the aeronautic, aerospace, steel, and aluminum coating sectors, as well as the vehicle coating sectors. So we're looking at dichromium trischromate, potassium hydroxy oxidizing dichromate, and pentazinc chromate octahydroxide. Those three substances, more commonly known, I'm sure, by their CAS or EC numbers, due to the length of their names, particularly the middle substance. Those three, as I mentioned, we're looking at the vehicle coating sector. We're looking at vehicle coatings, aeronautic and aerospace coatings, as well as major steel and aluminum coating sectors. The next substance, formaldehyde oligomeric reaction products with aniline, otherwise known as technical MDA, is mainly used for the manufacture of other substances. There are some minor uses as a hardener for epoxy resins, so an example would be the production of rolls, pipes, and molds, and as well as for adhesives. Then we have another phthalate being added to the SVHC candidate list. Bis 2-methoxyethyl phthalate is a much less prevalent phthalate. Excuse me. In fact, again, we see that no registration for this phthalate compound has been submitted to the ECHA, and hence the substance seems not to be manufactured or imported to the EU in quantities above 1 ton per year. That doesn't mean it's not manufactured or imported. It simply means that it's below 1 ton per year. The main uses for this substance in the past was a plasticizer in polymeric materials and paints, lacquers and varnishes, including printing inks. Arsenic acid is mainly used to remove gas bubbles from ceramic glass melt and for improving adhesion between copper foil and resin in the production of laminated printed circuit boards. Calcium arsenate is present in complex raw materials imported for manufacture of copper, lead, and a range of precious metals. It looks to be mainly used in metallurgical refinement processes. Same with trilead diarsenate. Again, this looks to be specifically in the metallurgical refinement process where you would find these two substances. Then we've got 2-methoxyaniline, orthoanisidine. And this is again a very specific substance. We see it mainly used in the manufacture of dyes for tattooing and coloration of paper, polymers, and aluminum foil. 4-tert-octylphenol, or octylphenol, is mainly used in the manufacture of polymer preparations and of ethoxylates. It's further used as a component in adhesives, coatings, inks, and rubber articles. This 2-methoxyethyl ether is used primarily as a reaction solvent or a process chemical in a wide variety of applications. It's also used as a solvent for battery electrolytes and can possibly be found in other products such as sealants, adhesives, funnels, and automotive care products. An important note, the 4-tert-octylphenol or phenol, is the first equivalent level of concern substance. So it was identified as an SVHC because of its endocrine disrupting properties that cause an equivalent level of concern to carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins. So this is the first substance that has been approved onto the SVHC candidate list based on an equivalent level of concern criteria. Now we'll continue to investigate the most common uses for the new SVHCs and the industries that look to be affected by these SVHCs, as I did go through that table fairly rapidly. So the first substance we'll talk about is DMAC, and it's a common solvent used in man-made fiber and polyurethane production. So we're looking at the clothing industry. It's also a reagent used in industrial coatings of polyamide films, paint strippers, and ink removers. But one of the things I should draw attention to is that it is used in polyurethane production. And polyurethanes are found in a variety of areas. In the manufacture of flexible, high-resilience foam seating, rigid foam insulation panels, microcellular foam seals and gaskets, durable elastomeric wheels and tires, automotive suspension bushings, electrical potting compounds, high-performance adhesives, surface coatings and surface sealants, synthetic fibers, for example, spandex, carpet underlays, and hard plastic parts, i.e., for example, in electronic instruments. Polyurethane is also used for the manufacture of hoses as it combines the best properties of both rubber and plastic. So DMAC could be found in polyurethanes, which are in a variety of products. MOCA, which is also used to make polyurethane products, so we are looking at the same ones that were mentioned for DMAC. Particularly, MOCA has been found in gears, gaskets, shoe soles, rolls, and belt drives and cameras, as well as a coating that helps set glues, plastics, and adhesives. So we would see MOCA in the manufacturing industry and, again, as part of polyurethane in various consumer goods. For MDA, 4,4-methylene dianiline, and its associated polymeric MDA, so PMDA, which includes technical or oligomeric. MDA is used in polyurethanes again for the manufacture of spandex fibers, thermoplastic resins and coatings, as well as rigid and semi-flexible foam insulation and particle board manufacture. So we're looking at the clothing industry, and again, we're looking at various consumer goods for these first 3 substances. As I previously mentioned, another phthalate has now been added to the candidate list, the bis-2-methoxyethyl phthalate. And it doesn't appear to be nearly as prevalent as the rest of the phthalate SVHCs. It is still a plasticizer, that like all phthalates, and looks to be used in paints, lacquers, varnishes, and printing inks. Calcium arsenate was originally used as a pesticide and a germicide. And now, within the dossier submitted to the ECHA from the member state, it's listed as being used pretty much exclusively in metallurgical processes. Tri-lead diarsenate is very similar in that it originated as a pesticide and herbicide, but is also now used in metallurgy. So we are really looking at the metallurgical industry being affected for both calcium arsenate and tri-lead diarsenate. Lead diazide, lead styphnate, and lead dipicrate are also included, and as explosive substances, lead explosive substances, and these are very likely to impact a particular section of industry only. If you are in that industry, of course, these are of heavy concern, but for non-explosive industries, non-explosive use of substances, it's not looking to have a huge impact. Arsenic acid is another example of a specifically used substance. However, there's one huge difference. That specific use is in the production of laminated printed circuit boards, which are practically a universal product vital to a wide variety of industries. So in terms of the affectee, we're looking at the electronics industry and, of course, various consumer goods that would use electronics, and that's the impact of arsenic acid. The aeronautic and aerospace industry is heavily impacted by this list, by these new additions, as 3 substances are almost exclusively used in that sector, as I mentioned. And these 3 substances also are used as vehicle coatings and in the aluminum coatings industry. As I previously mentioned, the refractory ceramic fibers are used exclusively as high-temperature insulation for industrial applications. These fibers were already on the SVHC candidate list, but identification issues have arisen since their first inclusion, and therefore they're being clarified and essentially re-added. If you have any further concerns or questions about the identity issues and what the differences are between the original inclusion and then this inclusion, if you are in any sort of industrial scenario that refractory ceramic fibers could possibly be used as part of the insulation, please don't hesitate to contact us, and I'll be glad to pass on that information. The current candidate list sits at 73 substances, as we've covered. And hopefully you've all experienced the fact that updates have been happening about twice a year. However, this is not a firm requirement. Within the REACH regulation, there is no specific timeline as to when substances can be added to the candidate list, how many times a year they should or can or have to be added. So in fact, substances can actually be added more often than the current rate of twice a year. The head of the ECHA has stated that the 136 SVHCs would be listed by the end of 2012. And everyone can do the math here. This means that 63 more substances will need to be added in 2012 to meet the quota set by the ECHA. Now, this quota hasn't just been set out in one statement. When the head of the ECHA has been questioned and concerns have arisen, whether by the MP in charge of working between the European Parliament and the ECHA, or more public questions have come up, the head of the ECHA has continually stated that the goal of 136 SVHCs will be met. Now, these 63 more substances that need to be added to meet the quota, there's a few options, and there hasn't really been any statement released on how they're going to make this happen, what sort of timeline they're working on in terms of 2 updates. So we're looking at a couple updates of over 30 substances, or if there's going to be multiple updates. I mean, there could be up to 10, although with the committee process or the comitological process that they have in play, doing multiple, more than 4 additions in a given year would probably be very difficult and very time-consuming. As for my opinion on which is going to happen, frankly, I have the feeling that they're going to do it more than twice a year to meet that. It could only be that it'll be 3 times this year, possibly 4, but again, as I mentioned, there is a process of approvals that they have to go through, and these do take time. So in terms of the ECHA, and really for industry as well, in a way it's easier to deal with 2 additions of a large amount of substances than constantly having to deal with maybe 5 to 10 substances, possibly 10 times in a given year. That I believe is easier for industry as well as the ECHA to do it in a couple, at maybe even 3 times in this upcoming year. So we're looking at 20 to 30 substances being added at a time, and possibly 2 to 4 times in this given year. That is what I feel is more likely to happen rather than, say, 5, 6, or even 10 additions of a much smaller amount of substances. Small water break, excuse me. Now, in talking about SVHCs, obviously it's important to revisit what the requirements are and what they might mean for your company. Lots of you have already sort of dealt with these issues, but as I said, it's always nice to remember and to touch on what exactly is required when a new SVHC, or even when the existing list of SVHCs is something you have to deal with. The legal obligations related to SVHCs, the most common ones, include communication and notification. We'll also touch on authorization very quickly within the presentation, and after this, of course, if you have any further questions, I'll be glad to go through any given part of the legal obligations in more detail. For communication, any producers or importers of articles placed on the market in the EU must now declare the presence of any of these substances, in addition to the existing 53 substances, of course. So we are looking at declaring for all 73 substances in an article in a concentration exceeding 0.1%, weight by weight. I have included the Article 33 of the REACH regulation, the source of the compliance requirement, and this essentially says that any supplier of an article containing an SVHC, which in the regulation is identified as a substance meeting the criteria in Article 57 and identified in accordance with Article 59.1 in a concentration above 0.1% weight by weight. So any supplier of an article containing an SVHC in a concentration above 0.1% weight by weight shall provide the recipient of the article with sufficient information available to the supplier to allow safe use of the article, including as a minimum the name of that substance. So for any professional users, for any downstream part of your supply chain that is not a consumer, consumers fall under a separate section which we will cover in a moment, but for any professional customers and any of your downstream users other than consumers, the information is required immediately, dealing with safe use of the article, and must include as a minimum the name of that substance. That is part of communication. The second part to communication is dealing with consumers. Now, of course, this will only concern a certain number, as not all of you are consumer-facing. Now, you may get requests passed on from further down your supply chain all the way back by consumers. And in those scenarios, on a request by a consumer, so consumers do not have to be automatically notified or automatically communicated with. Okay, they do not need to have an immediate communication based on the SVHC list. However, if they submit a request, if they submit a request, you have 45 days from receipt of that request to provide the information free of charge to the consumer that requested the information. This is again dealing with SVHCs in a concentration above 0.1% weight by weight within the article. And the information has to include, as a minimum, the name of the substance, and information to allow safe use of the article. So like I said, what does this mean? Really basic. Once a substance has been added to the SVHC list, you must declare its presence, communicate its presence to your downstream users if the concentration is above 0.1% of your product's weight. This has to be done immediately for professional customers and within 45 days of a request from consumers. Now, for communication, there is not a particular requirement around what the communication needs to look like, what that declaration needs to look like. The only requirements are it needs to allow for safe use of the article based on the SVHC included as well. Some SVHCs may be released if the article is heated, while others you want to keep it away from acids because they may break down and then the SVHC could impact the individual. For some, when you're looking at a consumer-facing declaration, for example, based on the SVHC safety handling, you may want to include an instruction of keep away from pregnant women or keep away from children. Keep out of the mouth of children. Okay? These are some of the examples of safe handling instructions for consumers. Now, obviously, on a professional side or an industrial side or anywhere on the supply chain, keeping away from pregnant women is not as logical of a safe handling instruction. And don't forget on these, you also have, on these communications, you have to include the name. And it's probably preferable to also include the CAS and EC number. Provide identification for the SVHC as well. If you have any further questions about what a communication needs to look like, please don't hesitate to ask us, and we'll be glad to help you. We can look at a project to help you craft your communications and perhaps even review them if required. So, continuing on the idea of a declaration of conformity. So a declaration needs to be part of a process that keeps all your information current and your declarations consistent. So upon request, you should be able to show the following items: who sent the declaration, what was the exact response, when was it sent, and how. What was asked of the supplier on the declaration, when and how the declarations are stored, how they are verified, and how and when they are updated. So, based on your supply chain, you may not be the original equipment manufacturer. And in dealing with attempting to collect all the information on SVHCs so that you can properly meet your compliance requirements, having a robust and thorough understanding of when, what, how, who you receive declarations and send declarations out are absolutely required. A firm, set documentation plan and process is essential. Now, your declarations may only have to say that your products do not contain any SVHCs above 0.1% weight by weight. That would be your communication. So it's essentially the non-communication for SVHCs. The regulation essentially states that you only have to communicate if you contain any SVHCs. But I'm sure you have all experienced, or many of you have experienced, the requests from your supply chain because they are dealing with REACH requirements. And you are shipping into the European Union. And in order to meet your REACH compliance requirements, you need to do the investigation. You need to understand if you have SVHCs in any of your products. Therefore, declarations of conformity from your suppliers, as well as your declaration of conformity, is your paper trail, demonstrating your communication requirements are being met, that you are complying to REACH. The next step in requirements when dealing with SVHCs in articles is notification. So these same producers and importers that are dealing with the communication requirement have 6 months from the date the new SVHCs were included, so this would be the 19th of June 2012, to notify the ECHA. So we have communication when dealing with your supply chain, and we have notification when dealing with the ECHA. So there are two, in order to be required to do a notification, there are two criteria. The SVHC is present in those articles in quantities totaling over 1 ton per producer or importer per year, and the SVHC is present in those articles above a concentration of 0.1% weight by weight. So the SVHC being present in the articles above a concentration of 0.1% weight by weight, that triggers the communication requirement. Then furthermore, to trigger the notification requirement, the SVHC itself that is present in those articles has to be in a quantity totaling over 1 ton per producer or importer per year. The SVHC, not the articles. Okay, the 1 ton per year applies only to the amount of SVHC and not the articles. A notification is created using the same software as a REACH registration dossier, and that tool is Euclid. It's a much less intense dossier than a registration dossier. And furthermore, the ECHA has worked to facilitate the task by making available pre-filled substance data sets in the Euclid 5.3 format. And the Euclid 5.3 format is simply the most recent version of that software. Each candidate substance has its own pre-filled data set, which can be downloaded from the candidate list webpage. The data sets that the ECHA has made available contain the identity, so substance name, the EC and or the CAS number, as well as the classification and labeling of that substance. The following information would have to be entered by the notifier: the identity and contact details of the notifier, the registration number of the SVHC if it's available, the tonnage range of the substance, and a brief description of the uses of the substance in the article itself and the uses of the article. And the submission tool for the notification dossier is again the same as the registration dossier. It is the REACH IT system. The next requirement in terms of SVHCs and articles is authorization. Any chemicals that are placed on the candidate list can also eventually be prioritized and then approved for the authorization list, where they will then be banned from use unless an authorization is submitted and approved before the applicable sunset date. Now, authorizations can have exempted uses or categories of uses. There can be conditions relating to the authorization, but at the same time, those conditions can be removed by a given review date. It's important to note that most, if not all, the substances on the current SVHC candidate list will eventually move on to the authorization list, and therefore will require an authorization for their use. This is a long-term process, but it is a reality that needs to be acknowledged. Authorizations are required on a per substance, per use, per supply chain basis. So if you or an actor up your supply chain have been granted an authorization, then that actor up the supply chain, that authorization will apply to you as well for that substance, for that use specifically. If the use is differentiated between what the actor up your supply chain was granted an authorization for and then your use, then that authorization is no longer valid. It's also important to note at this time that authorizations do not apply to articles that are being imported into the European Union as is. So, the SVHC being an integral part of an article, okay, authorizations cannot apply to that article. So you have a chair that contains an SVHC. You've had to do communication. You've even possibly had to do notification because you import a tremendous amount of chairs and the SVHC amount within those chairs, all of the imports combine for 1 ton of that SVHC. So you've done communication, you've done notification. Once those chairs go into the European Union, there are no additional changes. There are no coatings done to them. The SVHC is part of that chair already. It's not intentionally released. It's an integral part of that chair. An authorization is not required for imported articles. Now, I've also included, just so everyone can understand when I talk about prioritization and authorization lists, this is the process for substances to move on to the SVHC candidate list, onto the prioritization list, and onto the authorization list. I did do a webinar late last year in regards to the details around the authorization process. If there's more interest around exactly how that works, please visit our webinar page and review our older webinars. The recordings and the slide decks are all available there. So for the authorization process, these are referred to as Annex 15 dossiers. So a substance, okay, there's a registry of intentions. The member state registers that they have an intention to submit a dossier on a given substance to be added to the authorization process, to be added to the SVHC candidate list and possibly to the authorization list. Then there is the submission of the Annex 15 dossier, or more commonly known as the SVHC dossier, to the ECHA for a compliance check. So not only, do regular importers, producers, anyone who's had to deal with REACH registration or even notification know that there's a compliance check for those dossiers, the ECHA, of course, has a compliance check for member states submitting these dossiers. Then, once it's passed a compliance check, there's a publication of this dossier. So this dossier is made available. Once it has gone through a compliance check, it is made available for public viewing. Then, after the commenting periods and assessments, the substance is added to the candidate list, and that's where the Article 33 requirements kick in, so your communication, your notification. So we, of course, are dealing with 20 new SVHCs that have just completed Step 4. After this, substances can be moved onto a prioritization list. So this is the order in which substances will be reviewed for authorization. So that's groups at a time. So there are currently 2 groups of substances sitting as a prioritization list to be reviewed for authorization. As well, there is a group of substances on an authorization list already. So there are restrictions and authorizations in place for a group of substances that started out on the SVHC candidate list. An authorization will contain the following information. So when the ECHA releases an authorization for a given substance, for a given SVHC, it will contain substance identity, the substance intrinsic properties of very high concern, so why is an SVHC, a sunset date, which is the date by when a substance can no more be used without authorization, the application date, the date before which an application for authorization must be submitted for each use that is not exempted from the authorization requirement. So not only do you have your sunset date, but you have an application deadline. So the deadline by which you must you must make and submit your application if you are looking for authorization to continue using an SVHC. Then there is also the review period for uses if appropriate. So as I previously mentioned, within an authorization, it can be sort of a blanket or umbrella authorization where all the uses require authorization, but there can also be exempted uses or exempted categories of uses. And those exempted categories of uses or uses actually have a review period attached to them. So just because they are exempted at this time, for example, in the future there will be a review on those exemptions, and those can actually be eliminated so that eventually an authorization becomes what I would call a blanket or an umbrella authorization where it covers all the uses. Now, I had talked about SVHC documentation and its importance when I was dealing with declarations of conformity. This quote from the guidance on SVHC really brings it home. The bolded section is actually bolded in the guidance itself, and it says, documenting this is recommended to producers and importers of articles in general, as it facilitates demonstrating REACH compliance towards customers and inspecting or enforcing authorities. So they are talking about the documentation of every step of your REACH program. So the reality is that there's an investigation. You need to determine whether your products are substances or mixtures or articles. Then you need to determine or understand what your requirements are and what are the triggering criteria for those requirements. And then you need to determine if any of your products meet those criteria. And if they don't, you need to have that decision process all documented. So should customers or should enforcing authorities ask you, although you may have no requirements in terms of declaring the SVHCs or notifying the ECHA, or for substances and mixtures, for example, registering, all of the groundwork, all of the process to investigate the reality of REACH for your company should be documented as proof that you have understood REACH and you are complying, in that there are no requirements that actually apply to you. We've also had some input from some major industry players in terms of what REACH has done to impact them, their challenges, as well as how they have been dealing with REACH. So there's been some input from some companies that we have spoken with and that we personally deal with as well. Major industry players, specifically those that were affected by registration, began dealing with REACH from the moment it was officially published, so that's 2007, and then some even from its inception, which was over 8 years ago. Even larger companies who dealt only with articles started trying to understand their responsibilities for SVHCs. So those companies that didn't have to do registration because they dealt with articles, okay, they even started trying to understand their responsibilities for SVHCs a year before the first SVHC list was even published. So this is, again, part of that documentation, part of that understanding, part of dealing with REACH is understanding what and how REACH affects you. Of course, we've also heard of companies and that only began tackling and dealing with REACH once their customers started asking. For North American companies, if a given company doesn't actually import to Europe themselves, then REACH doesn't impact them until their customers start asking. So if they haven't needed to be aware of it, it's definitely understandable if they don't import to the European Union that possibly they haven't had to deal with REACH, and therefore the requests coming in, all of a sudden they become alerted to the vastness and requirements around REACH and begin dealing with those requirements for their customers. REACH compliance has been seen to be handled in many different ways. So we're looking at manual data gathering, software, whether it's externally provided or developed internally, which of course is very heavily resource-based. And this is a major enhancement for supply data gathering, especially when dealing with SVHCs and the constant updating of that list. It's understandable that constantly needing to gather that new data, it would be much better the more automated and organized that system is. There's external consulting or internal training and employee development, again, heavily based on resources and size of the company. There's even been e-learning programs for vendors, everything from webinars for vendors to an interactive software option where they can see a presentation on their own time. And of course, major supplier engagement. So this is again based on your pull within your supply chain size. These suggestions, of course, will not apply to every level of company out there, but you can see what the various options are when developing a REACH program. So for major supplier engagement, it's dealing with the suppliers and helping them to understand REACH and stay ahead of the curve, and possibly restrict or remove substances as permitted by cost and by technological function of the substance within a given product. Some of the difficulties that have been encountered so far in the process: lack of awareness in the supply chain, lack of knowledge in the supply chain. We've had some of our industry contacts have the experience that European suppliers are actually more poorly informed than North American suppliers. As we continue to go through this industry input section, you'll see that we've also got the other side of the coin where they've dealt with the European suppliers that are more aware than North American suppliers. So we've got both ends of the spectrum. There's been the refusal to respond. There are commercial challenges as alternative substances cost more, and there's, of course, the increase in product development difficulties, be it research, be it pure materials. Then there's the sustaining the removal of a substance if that's the route you choose in certain product lines, or for all your product lines if you're aiming to eventually remove all the SVHCs from your products. This is, of course, difficult if your vendors buy from multiple suppliers. Then, of course, as mentioned, the ever-changing SVHC list does not make anyone's life any easier. And the lack of adoption across industries of a standardized format for collecting information. And I think this, in particular, really goes around the fact that the SVHC requirement of communication is immediate upon publishing of the SVHC candidate list, and yet at the same time, if you attempt, or if it's been attempted, that you collect this information, once the substances are proposed, there are many difficulties around gathering information for substances that haven't officially been added. Although, because there's an immediate requirement, it only makes sense to attempt to gather information on those substances and their presence within products the moment the initial substances are proposed before they're added to the list. You need to deal with that immediate requirement as soon as possible. But of course, because there is a standardized format, and because in some cases companies are still, to use the term, catching up to REACH, it's very difficult to ask about things that haven't officially been added into law. We were lucky enough in particular to have a pretty good relationship with Paul Ellis at Kingfisher. Paul is the Quality Regulation Manager for Europe's leading home improvement retailer, and they have over 900 stores in 8 countries, for those of you that may not have heard of Kingfisher. And they really have a robust and industry-leading REACH program there. Paul in particular has been dealing with REACH for at least 8 years. And of course, in dealing with it for this long and developing a program really from the ground up before most companies were dealing with REACH, he provides an invaluable point of view. Kingfisher in particular views REACH as important because of growing consumer concerns. So this is an area where environmental safety and human safety is, of course, coming to the forefront all over the place in the news, be it on the internet, be it on TV, be it in the newspapers. It's garnering much attention. Product safety, of course, from chemicals, for the environment, for humans. And Kingfisher has long had CSR credentials on their chemicals and really put safety first in terms of their consumers. He went on further to mention that the issues for the vendors are knowing which SVHC to look for and then where to find them in the product. That this is the most common challenge facing vendors and retailers, because as I mentioned with the uses and materials, there are certain SVHCs that are highly, highly unlikely to show up in certain products. So for many vendors, it's helping them to be less overwhelmed. You see 73 substances, and the reality is that as part of your program, it may be important to assess what might actually show up in your products and get the proper information and allow your vendors to deal with groups of substances at a time that may actually show up in the products. The difficulties that Paul has encountered, I did include in the previous slide of sort of major industry players and overall the difficulties, but I found it reassuring to know that even a large company with obviously a fairly large market share and a lot of weight in their supply chain, I'm sure, they encounter many of the same difficulties. How they deal with those difficulties may be at a different scale than smaller businesses, but they have them. The fact that their vendors are not aware of REACH, the internal commercial challenges, in attempting to maybe deal with alternative substances for a long-term solution to REACH, getting the SVHCs and possible SVHCs, or taking, an SVHC list and making that the basis of a restricted substances list so that their products do not contain, carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxins, and trying to really stay ahead of REACH. Sustaining the removal of a substance, especially if the vendor buys in components from various suppliers, we talked to that earlier, and then lack of knowledge. So we're looking at lack of awareness, lack of knowledge. This is common throughout business and industry. Kingfisher has developed their own internal data gathering system, which I alluded to in the fact that they've been dealing with REACH for 8 years, almost a decade at this point. And they not only deal with REACH, but of course many other compliance concerns as they deal with retailers and of course consumer facing. So the amount of environmental compliance and safety compliance needs that they have, they need a fairly robust internal data gathering system. And frankly, at that point, the Ascent compliance software offering was not available 8 years ago. So for their system, they don't limit their methods to just the system data capture. They've engaged with a number of vendors to encourage them to adopt a faster pace to REACH than they normally would have done. So they've worked with key vendors to remove some substances from products, and that's allowed them to learn how to remove substances, how to identify viable alternatives, and how to sustain a substance absent from a product. They've also provided an e-learning program on their compliance methods so that can be disseminated down the chain. And they've also provided seminars to educate vendors. But even now, 2 years after REACH has come into force and dealing with the SVHCs in particular, they're finding the vendors are not prepared, or they have their own compliance methods in place which may not be as robust and to the level that is required for your compliance program. Another individual that we are privileged enough to have a fairly decent relationship with is Barry Podd at Kimberly-Clark, and he's the Associate Director for Global Regulatory Affairs, and he's provided some interesting insight as well. Obviously, the size of Kimberly-Clark, the size of KC has helped as suppliers tend to respond to information requests. But Barry in particular has found that is true more so when they are based in Europe and are aware of the requirements laid down in the REACH regulation. So although, Kimberly-Clark is an enormous organization, they still have difficulties. The suppliers tend to respond, but it's not a guarantee, and especially European suppliers have been successful for them, but North American suppliers are, or in other countries, be it Asia, there's obviously a struggle for Kimberly-Clark as well. He goes on to specify that the quality of the information varies with the size of the company, and then broadly speaking, the best information has been received from those companies with resources dedicated to implementing the REACH regulation as opposed to those where the responsibility is split. So obviously, again, size of the company and resources, the importance being placed on REACH vastly affects the quality of the response, the quality of the information that even Kimberly-Clark receives. You get a specific department or a specific person in charge of REACH, and that's obviously going to have a different impact than, say, a quality manager or a compliance manager or an EH&S officer who now all of a sudden is also being tasked to deal with REACH. And obviously the training time, the learning time, learning curve for that severely affects the quality of the answers that can be received. The situation is often more challenging when the supplier is based outside of Europe, and this happens a lot with global companies because the level of knowledge they have of REACH is not always at a consistently high level. So we see so far that we've had some of our contacts and some of the individuals that we deal with, some of the companies that we deal with, that have had better information from North American than from their European suppliers. But in terms of Kimberly-Clark, they have experienced that their suppliers in Europe provide them with at least more likely to answer, and of course the quality of the answer, but those suppliers outside of Europe, it's dealing with the level of knowledge, and that, again, we're looking at training, vendor and supplier training before a request can be answered on raw materials that are supplied, and although the suppliers, of course, want to cooperate with a company as large as Kimberly-Clark, they're not always in a position to do so immediately, and therefore there is lag time on those responses. In terms of Kimberly-Clark, they're in a fortunate position because of the product range of not using SVHCs in the products. Of course, that's great, but they still need to collect the information required to help us respond to inquiries. So this is all about that documentation part of REACH from our customers in the ways prescribed in the REACH regulation. This involves monitoring developments to the candidate list of SVHCs and checking each time that it is updated to ensure that the substances listed are not used in any of our products or raw materials. For a company like ours, this is not difficult to do, but given that the candidate list is updated twice a year, and of course, as I mentioned, it could be even more in the future. This is a resource-intensive exercise. So The difficulty may not be there, but it is still resource and cost intensive. Now we'll look a little bit more in depth in terms of how Ascent can help. Be you a major player or a smaller company, our consulting services can cover the whole range of what you might be interested in, whether it's managing a whole program and its compliance not only to REACH but ROS, CLP, and other environmental standards, ensuring compliance with these regulatory agencies and compliance regulations, reviewing and evaluating environmental requirements and changes, i.e. the SVHC list, as published by regulating bodies, supporting the sourcing and selection of electronic and mechanical components, serving as a subject matter expert on regulatory matters, whether that's entire documents or Q&A or knowledge support, specification and drawing review for compliance, obsolescence management and part substitution, and of course working with suppliers on corrective actions, as well as helping with the training and knowledge of suppliers. We also, of course, have our software services. The Ascent Compliance software automatically gathers environmental compliance data from your supply chain. It's a platform for suppliers to enter environmental compliance information. It can generate custom reports based on the gathered compliance data, so it allows for a top-level view of the progress or a drill down to particular parts or products, and it instantly isolates problem areas based on products, parts, or materials. It can generate compliance documents for enforcement agencies and downstream users. It acts as a platform for internal teams to manage environmental data and make internal declarations based on obtained information, be it testing, be it particular supplier contacts who are not entering it into the system, and those particular, that information is entered as an engineering override. It's an automatic communication tool to inform suppliers of changes to environmental regulations, the easiest example being the update to the SVHC list. And there's even the option of a free model for large cap companies looking to implement a software platform with their supply chain. And this is a quick screenshot of the basics of our software offering. So this is the immediate dashboard. You can see the pie chart as to which parts have been checked, unchecked, which are compliant, what the supplier breakdown looks like. You can see on the left-hand side, there's viewing the parts, the component list, product list. You can mark a group of parts. You can flag them and then indicate their REACH status. And of course, as I mentioned, there's ROS, IPC 1752, JIG, Prop 65, and any other custom or particular regulations that you might be dealing with, including CPSIA. Under the suppliers section of the toolbar, you can view all your suppliers, your distributors. You can email them, whether it's for an update or a particular question or further information. There is file storage, and of course there's the profiles of all of your users and your suppliers and dealing with their access to the system as well. Now, it is 3:02 p.m., so I'm going to take a quick look at the questions and see if there's any I can read in, say, the next 3 minutes or 2 minutes and deal with. Just one moment. I will look at those and see how many questions we've had come in. We've had a few. So it's looking like that many of these will be answered within the FAQ document that will be ready by Friday. So the slides, the webinar deck, as well as the recording and an FAQ document will be available by Friday of this week. All right, there was a question about the copy of the presentation, which I think I've dealt with. There's a question about notification of substances and articles. If our products do not intentionally emit or expose customers to any SVHCs during normal use, do we have to go through the notification process even if it's more than 0.1% by weight? All right, so it's not just more than 0.1% by weight, it's also that tonnage requirement, so that's important to understand. But in terms of intentionally emitting or exposing customers to any SVHCs during normal use, there is an exemption around notification, and that is an exposure-based exemption. However, this exemption is not much of one at all in terms of the criteria required to meet it. You have to exclude exposure to humans or the environment during normal and foreseeable conditions of use, including disposal, which is huge. The guidance even goes on to state that it may be more difficult and more costly to demonstrate no exposure than to basically simply complete the notification, especially because the notification, it's already partly done for you by the ECHA in terms of the actual substance requirements within the notification dossier. So that's a great question, but I would very much caution you on looking into exemptions from notification in terms of exposure, because it will be very difficult, time-consuming, and costly to be able to prove that there's no exposure to humans or the environment. It's not just customers or humans, it's also the environment during normal and foreseeable conditions of use, including disposable. Okay. And one other question I'd like to hit, if we have time. Do you know if there are plans to control SVHCs at the level of the homogeneous material like in ROS instead of per article? I came across one or two customers that said that they do not want SVHCs above 0.1% per homogeneous material. Well, the idea is that eventually the European Union would like to have all of their sort of environmental and substance compliance regulations really under one umbrella of REACH, as REACH has already taken care of or taken under its wing a lot of existing regulations. It's replaced quite a few. There's even the dream, I'm going to call it a dream at this time, of including ROS under REACH. And the WE directive as well, and this is very, very long term. So although I say this, there is no particular timetable. There is just the objective that the European Union would like to simplify and be working with far less numbers of regulations. Now, France has put out a statement of enforcement for SVHCs and articles that they are dealing on a per component basis. Now, this is not homogeneous materials at this point, but they are looking for complex articles that each component, each article, finished article in itself, be assessed the 0.1% weight by weight. So this is obviously different than the ECHA's enforcement mandate and the remainder of the member state countries, in that it is the finished article as is. So if a jet plane is imported into the European Union, and that's obviously a huge example, then the SVHC content is 0.1% weight by weight of the entire plane. If we're talking about the France enforcement model, we are looking at each component, each finished product of that plane. So we're talking about the seats, we're talking about any onboard computers, we're talking about the doors, which are finished products sort of on their own. So that's a very big difference. Again, if you're looking for further information on that, I would encourage you to go to the Ascent Compliance website and look at our webinar section, and all past webinars that we've given are there to be found and to be listened to, reread, and I go much more into the France interpretation and those issues there. But as for the homogeneous material level for SVHCs, I understand why some customers may be asking for that, trying to get as much information on the materials in the products as possible, and that is a valiant effort, and I understand, again, why they're asking. However, from a regulatory point of view, I don't see that occurring in REACH for a significant amount of time, if ever, because on a practical level, that is very, very difficult, and homogeneous materials, when dealing with exposures to the consumer or the professional user, may not always be dealing with safety. And the idea of the SVHC candidate list is to deal with the safety of humans and the environment. However, getting as much material information as possible allows you or your supply chain to further determine what the SVHC content is throughout a given product. All right, we are now looking at 309. So I'm going to stop at this point. I do have some questions. I have received a couple questions both right now and then in the earlier session about SVHCs in mixtures and in substances. And I would mention the biggest thing is that yes, we are looking at SVHCs have to be included on a safety data sheet the moment that they are added. So an SVHC is considered a hazardous hazardous component of a mixture or a substance, and therefore this has to be disseminated on an SDS. That's very quick, but I will provide a more robust answer within the document that will be prepared after this. All right, thank you very much for attending. Sorry that I've gone over by about 10 minutes here, and I hope that this was very useful for everyone. Thanks again for attending, and please don't hesitate to contact after the webinar has ended. Thanks again. Bye-bye.